Does God want you to have faith for these last days? Right now, we're going to pick up on one of the stories that I previously talked about, but God is leading me to get back into this again because there's something else we need to see. Not only does God want you to have faith for these last days, God wants you to be used to help meet the needs of others in these last days. So what we're going to do is we are going to go look at the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with his disciples again. This is John Dowler of Prayer Builders in Winona, Minnesota. And right now, I'm going back. I know a few days ago, we were actually looking at this. We were looking at the miracle of Jesus and the disciples feeding the 5,000. And when we started this whole series, God was dealing with me about showing. He started taking me through verses where I could see. It was like, look, this is how I trained my disciples for the last days. And right now, this is no different. The 12 disciples were actually referred to as our foundation. He said that this gospel that we're now preaching was set on the foundations of the apostles and the prophets. So right now, we can look back at how this started out, how they got trained, and see some of the lessons that Jesus taught them. Now, previously, we're not going to go there right now, but previously we had looked in Matthew chapter 14 about Jesus feeding the 5,000. And there was something that I did not bring up when I was previously teaching on that, and I want to look at that now. And what I'm going to do, let's go over in John chapter 5 or John chapter 6. And in John chapter 6, this is John's account of this whole miracle. And when he got into this miracle, he brings up something in this that's not in any of the other accounts. He brings up the account of this young boy that was there that literally had what was needed to meet the needs of these 5,000. And what I think is just so amazing is this. Here's what happens in this whole miracle. Let's go ahead, and I'm just going to go ahead and read this. In John chapter 6, let's just go ahead and read this. In John chapter 6, let's start at verse 2. It says, "There was a great multitude that followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed with those who were diseased. And Jesus went up to the mountain, and there with his disciples." And then down at verse 4 it says, "Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. And Jesus," at verse 5, "lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' And then he said, now look at this. It said that he said this to test him. Jesus said this. It says, but he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do." Now this right here is a huge thing, because this is showing how Jesus was led. Jesus, anything God does and anything Jesus does is not without being perfectly calculated ahead of time. God doesn't just do things randomly without thinking. God just doesn't shoot from the hips with no purpose involved. This whole thing was meant, right here when he asked Philip this, he was stretching Philip's faith. And this is something we didn't see in the other accounts. But it says, "Then Jesus lifted up his eyes. He saw," in verse 5, "he saw the multitude coming towards him. He said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he knew what he would do." Jesus already knew what was going to happen. He had already seen it. He already saw this whole thing play out. And Philip answered him. And see, this is what needs to happen. When God is leading us in these when we get led in these last days, whatever God says to us, whatever he shows us, whatever he starts leading you to do, God has already seen the outcome. He is knowing. And when he tests you, what he's testing is your faith. he's testing you, engaging your faith. And he's wanting to see where you're at, which in most cases he's already knowing that. But he's wanting to prove it out. And Philip answered him and said, well, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. And then he says in verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? So now we're going to see the source of this is what they had to deal with for food. And whatever this was, this was something that a child was carrying around. So it's not going to be something that was a huge amount. It's going to be a very limited amount. It was probably his lunch. Maybe it was going to cover him as a lunch and a snack or whatever. But we are dealing with a relatively small amount. Think of a kid's lunchbox. That's what we're dealing with here. And a kid's not going to eat. I mean, if you know kids, I mean, when they're younger, they're not going to be eating that much, especially if they're doing activities. If they're doing activities, they eat usually very little then. But then it says, okay, this is what Jesus said at verse 10. It says, then Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, and it says, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And I covered this before. If there's 5,000 men in a religious gathering or a church service, there's probably at least 10,000 women. Because half the men are probably home watching football. Or here, I don't know. My wife laughed when I said that in the last teaching. She said, you said they were watching football. Well, no, they wouldn't have been watching football then. Maybe the other men were at the Gladiator Stadium watching someone getting eaten by a lion or something. I don't know. But they were watching some kind of a sporting event probably. But so anyway, if there were 5,000 men, there were probably 2 to 1 women. And then if there were 2 to 1 women, a lot of those women are probably going to have maybe 2 to 5 kids at this time. Who knows? But there would be a lot of people, probably well over 20,000. So then it said Jesus made the people to sit down. And it says there was much place in the grass at verse 10. So the men sat down in number about 5,000. And it was the other accounts that said that was the men, not including women and children. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost. Now, when this happened, I was actually thinking about this, and I had touched on this previously. Now, if you want to safely figure, there was 20,000 people. And let's just figure initially here the disciples. If you took the disciples, and if there was like 20,000 people, and if you took, there was 20,000 people out here scattered all over this open field area, and then Jesus is commanding them to sit down, and they have this very small amount. Now, it was a small amount when it started off in Jesus' hands. But then if he had to take the small amount and divide it by 12 and give it to his disciples, and then they're going to have 1/12 of whatever he started with, which is going to be significantly smaller. So each of them are going to be going forth to their section. Now, if you took 20,000 people, I had just figured on my phone here, if you took 20,000 people, divided it by 12, that would be 1,700 people in each section. So you're dealing with like 1,700 people in each of these sections. That's probably a fair estimate. And then they have 1/12 of what was originally provided. And I just look at this, and there was just like so many things. I mean, they were being put in a faith where their faith was being stretched. They were put in a place where their faith was being pushed. And they were thinking, and when they began to give, this stuff did not run out. It kept being given and given and given. And this was in a place where there was no food. There was no place to buy food. If they were out in a deserted area. There was no place to get there. And Jesus, they were far enough away that Jesus didn't, in the other accounts, Jesus had said that he didn't want them fainting on their way back because they had nothing to eat. So he was concerned about this. So here we are in a place where there's virtually no food or very little food, and there's a whole bunch of people that need to eat. Now this ties to the last days. We need to have faith in God, and Jesus put them in this situation. He already knew what God was going to do. He already knew what God wanted to do. He put them in this situation. And then what we see is, I just wanted to go back to this and look at this, because something is involved here, and this is really important in end time faith. End time faith is willing to give. End time faith is willing to distribute into another's hands. End time faith is not trying to hold on to every last bit. This little boy was not standing alongside just thinking, man, this is all I got. I mean, I'm hungry. I'm not going to give them my food. I mean, I brought this so I could eat. I mean, all these people aren't my responsibility. This little boy just got pulled in, and when he was approached concerning this, he was willing to let it go for the greater good. and then Jesus blessed this, and then Jesus didn't hang on to it, and Jesus gave it forth again. And then when the disciples got a hold of it, they didn't hang on to it. They went ahead. I mean, this was like seed that had been sowed once and then twice and then 3 times. This seed just kept passing through hands, and it was going to the greater good. And when people are not holding back and they are willing to give, and it's getting passed on and passed on, what starts happening? Multiplying starts happening. Multiplying starts happening, and it starts happening, and it continues, and it goes again and again and again and again. And then, some people don't like to talk about sowing and reaping. Some people don't like it, and that's because they want to hold on. Their faith is in what they've got. But that didn't happen with this boy. And do you know what the thing is? The Lord, now everybody else would be all caught up in the ooh and the ah of look what has happened here, all these flashy miracles. Look at all these people that have been fed. When this was all said and done, you know what is so awesome? Jesus only does what he sees the Father doing. He only says what he hears the Father saying. And then this is what Jesus said. Look at verse 12. It says, so when all the people were filled, it said, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, so nothing is lost. Jesus was still thinking about this little boy. Jesus gathered all of these. Now, if you go back and you read in the other accounts, I don't know if in all the accounts, it says this. In verse 13, it says, therefore, they gathered them all up, and they filled 12 baskets with the fragments. Now, I don't know what happened with all these baskets. My inclination is to think these baskets went back to the boy. Whatever was left went back to the boy. And he said, gather these up. He did not want any of the abundance and the overflow lost. He didn't want it just going to waste. And he said, gather it up. And we don't see with all these miracles, we don't see all the details that happen. But I don't think it was any coincidence either that there was 12 baskets. Each one of these disciples were having to pick up over all the overflow. They had so much work involved. They were all having to go around and gather up everything. And it was still the 12. I mean, there were 12 disciples. There were 12 baskets. God's just trying to drive this home and put this. He's trying to let them see. You know what? We had what appeared to be lack, and then not only that, but then everything got taken care of. But then on top of that, there's a whole bunch left over, and we've got all kinds of stuff to give now. And God can still do this. God is a multiplier. We need to go back to these stories because this is how those disciples were trained for the last days. Jesus trained them. And I'll tell you what, we need to be trained by the Master. He knows how to train us. He will train us right now. If you will reach out to him, he will show you things to do right now. He'll show you things to act on. He will show you things to give. I mean, part of this boy's and not this little lad, part of his family's sustenance. I believe that all these baskets ended up going back to his family, and who knows? Since there was 12 baskets, the 12 disciples may have been the ones that helped him carry those things back home. I don't know. But I'm kind of thinking that blessing came back on his family, and his family was probably taken care of for quite a while from these baskets. God is in the business of meeting needs, and that's what he wants to do. And I just wanted to encourage you with that today. Stir your faith. And I had to get into that again. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. I'm looking forward to getting into this again tomorrow, and we are going to look at some of the miracles that Jesus taught his disciples. So anyway, I am glad you're here. And if you're on YouTube, if you're on Facebook, shoot comments into me. If you got questions about anything, if there's any questions, you got questions about the last days, fire them in here. And the answer to your question may be one of my next videos, because I've already done that and I'm willing to do that. So anyway, blessings to you. And I just want to remind you, and don't you forget it, Jesus is coming back.